Do little glimpses of a fantasy world flash before your eyes in the quiet moments of your day? And do you wish these little glimpses could be made into something wonderful, like a book or a movie? I feel like a lot of people I've talked to feel that way. I know at least 3 people in my real life who have sheepishly told me that they've been working on a fantasy story for years, but have just never gotten around to really writing it down. I get it, because this is something that I'm struggling through right now. I have imagined an entire world, an entire series of stories, but it's all trapped inside my head. All of my characters are waiting impatiently to come to life. It makes me tired just thinking about it. I think of it kind of like brain clutter. It's a weird sort of creative block, because it's not a lack of ideas, it's a failure of my brain being able to organize and present those ideas, without it all just being one confusing mess. I love world building. The planning stage is my favorite part of any writing project. Making up lore and characters and histories is such a comfortable exercise. Not like the agony of actually writing something down. It's so much easier to come up with ideas for projects than it is to actually execute those ideas. I think you can really tell, or maybe the right word is feel, when you're reading or watching something that the author put a lot of work into world building. Attention to detail can make all the difference in a fantasy world. Even the most fantastical fictional places can seem real. If I open a book and there's a nice map in the front, I always take it as a good omen. When I think of maps and a fantasy world creation, I think of Tolkien especially. The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings books were largely byproducts of his love for fantasy language creation and world building, taking shape as bedtime stories for his children. And that pure love of creation definitely plays a part in why his work has stood the test of time. You know it's a classic fantasy world when the prospect of spending hours reading wiki articles about all the lore is an enjoyable rather than tedious one. I used to have an encyclopedic guide to Lord of the Rings that I would read every day on the school bus. I just couldn't get enough of the details. That's the kind of world I aspire to create, the one that my readers are interested in learning everything about, without it just being a giant exposition dump. The danger of world building lies in how enjoyable it is. Making maps and playing God, it's easy to get stuck in your own fantasy world. But there's also a sort of proprietary protectiveness as well. Before you put it all out there, the world belongs solely to the author or the artist. I guess maybe I'm just taking one last look at it before I'm comfortable opening the doors for an audience. And maybe that's why my story is hesitant to want to come out. I don't know which worst case scenario is worst. No audience at all and screaming into the void, which I often feel like when I make things online these days. Or being met with an audience who hates what you've made. It certainly makes it awkward, if not anxiety-inducing, to make yourself that vulnerable. I try to adopt the mantra of, I am cringe, but I am free. I think that's the key to creative happiness. The journey into world building, my most recent project, started with this little alien creature named Marshmallow, wandering around a strange swamp world. And then it became a map, and then it became a series of murder mysteries. She just appeared as something that I kept doodling everywhere when I wondered what I should be drawing, as if the answer was in my pencil all along. I think she started appearing around 2017, and I can't believe that was 7 whole years ago. Sometimes these things just need time to develop and incubate. I got good grades doing my homework on the bus the morning before school, and I thrive on procrastination in general, but I've never done any of my best creative work in a rush. I think the most valuable resource an artist can have is the free time to just percolate. The world that Marshmallow exists in is called the Great Swamp. This part of my world really seemed to materialize during the pandemic. Some people made sourdough bread, but I made maps, which was really enjoyable, especially when it came to naming the locations. I used to be a big user of random fantasy name generators back in the day. I felt like it was important for my characters and locations to have unique, completely unpronounceable names. But my outlook has changed. Now my world has places named Gull's Rest Quarry, Marsh Harbor, Reedshire Bay. I'm just not clever enough to make up languages and names like Tolkien. So now I just keep a notebook of weird names and words that I hear and like, collecting them and tucking them away for when I might need them. After a few years, my world was becoming more real. Characters and whole families started appearing, like Animal Crossing villagers moving onto my island. It seemed like every day someone new would appear. But the problem that I'm having is that I'm not sure how to put it out there in a way that people can understand. How can I share my story when I'm not even sure what form it needs to take? I've tried so many times to decide how to release my story. And I've changed my mind so many times that it feels like I'm going crazy. Some days it feels like I have to write a novel. Some days it has to be a comic. A couple years ago, I thought a video game or a visual novel was the answer. And I'll often go back and forth between all of them. It's not that the story has no direction. I'm familiar with every scene. It's just a communication blockage. So in order to cope with this creative frustration, I've set myself a little world-building exercise. Actually, a literal world-building exercise, in that I am actually going to build a building. To pull something out from the fantasy world and to bring it into the real world, in hopes that it will somehow summon my ability to bring my whole story out with it. My rationale behind this exercise is to build the most important building in my world. If you want to follow along or try this yourself, just ask yourself this question: what is the most important building in my world? It might be something obvious, like an imperial palace or a temple full of magical ancient relics. It might also be a bakery. The most important building is important because of what happens inside. It houses what is most valued by the people who live there, and in theory, should reflect some core element of your story. The building that I've chose is the post office. More specifically, it is the postal headquarters, located in the capital city, Marsh Harbor. For this exercise, it was important for me to use the materials that were readily available to me. I don't want to go digging through my supplies, wasting valuable time that I need to be solving this problem with. And I didn't want to go out and buy materials when I'm suddenly consumed with a sort of creative frenzy. One of my favorite materials to use is cardboard. It's so versatile, and there's just so much of it around these days. Sometimes, when I'm stressed out or very, very bored, I like to make little houses out of cardboard. The thin stuff, like cereal or cracker boxes, work the best for walls, and the corrugated stuff, like from Amazon boxes, are great as bases, or if you peel off the top layer of flat cardboard, it makes a great roof tile. I don't like to measure it out or to do much planning at all when building these little houses, but that's okay, because my world was built by little animals and other little creatures, so it's a miracle that they can read and wear pants, let alone being architects. There's nothing here that some tape and a thick layer of glue can't fix. It's less of a scale model than an imagination reference. When you're building, you can ask yourself what materials would actually be used in your world. What would be readily available? And how would it be processed? Who would be building? I really also enjoy the painting stage, because that's typically when those questions get answered. Also, how you decorate your building is important, because a culture will seek to artistically represent the elements that they hold to be important. My building isn't really too decorated, but there is a prominent clock tower, which would be an important point of reference in the capital city. The creatures of Marsh Harbor certainly wouldn't have cell phones in their pockets to keep track of the time, but perhaps some might have little pocket watches. I think this must be the highest building in the city as well, as a focal point in the exact center, and the city would be connected not in roadways, but in canals, for the postal boats and ferries. Sometimes it can really help to be working on something with your hands when you're solving a writing or other creative problem. There's a quote by Pablo Picasso that I really like. Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. So maybe keep a little notebook or some scrap paper next to you as you're working on this, just in case your inspiration does strike. So why am I building a little post office, you may ask? Why is that my world's most important building? Because I think it's important that these little creatures that live in my world aren't connected by modern technology. In today's world, it's now a luxury to not have to be bound to your devices, to be able to unplug and become unreachable. I'd love to throw my phone into the ocean if it wasn't also my camera and my lifeline to the outside world. I'd love to only be reachable by letter, because I feel like my written correspondence would be more thoughtful and meaningful. Plus, I really love stationery. Having the post office as my most important building also shaped my world's government. There's no despotic monarch, just the Postal Admiralty. Postal workers are the captains of little ships that sail around the Great Swamp, keeping everyone connected with physical tokens and messages. I want to build a little community, I suppose. A deliberate, analog, and old-fashioned one. I know that first and foremost, I have to work at making my story world real for myself. Otherwise, how would it ever feel real to an audience? Telling someone about a story idea that you have is a lot like telling someone about a dream you had. Most of the time, you can feel a sort of generalized disinterest, even if they pretend otherwise. Storytelling is a skill that needs honing, like the sharpening of a sword. Maybe the harsh reality is that I simply haven't put in the required work yet. Even if it feels like I've already done a lot, perhaps I simply haven't done enough. I mentioned earlier that a stumbling block that I've been experiencing is what form my story is to take. I suppose that the simplest answer is, for starters, it just needs to exist in some form. Which it does, in the form of half a novel and a comic book script. But that's just really not enough yet. Sometimes I wonder if I needed to write my story as a novel or a comic because my ego needs to see my work on a shelf at the bookstore. I feel like I've always operated with that being the ultimate marker of having made it. Fantasizing about seeing my name in lights, or at least at the mall. So maybe letting go of those old ideas could free me up to express myself in new ways that are more accessible, like in video. I could never just settle on one medium or art form. Words aren't enough for me without pictures, and even that can feel limiting sometimes. If I feel like I've painted myself into a corner, or am stuck with a singular label forever, I tend to panic. I've had to redefine myself as a mixed media artist in order to maintain some semblance of sanity, or the appearance of my sanity when someone dares to ask me what it is that I do. Because the term feels pretty all-encompassing and could really mean anything. That's the great thing about walking the artist's path. Even if the gatekeepers try to hide it from you, you always just get to make things up as you go along. So here it is, the finished post office. I'm pretty happy with the way that it turned out, especially considering that it started off as a hot chocolate box. If nothing else, it feels good to see a little part of my story existing in a tangible form in this world. It feels like a good start. Now I get to put it on my desk, and hopefully it will signal to the creative part of my brain that it's time to get this thing moving. Or if nothing else, I can just sit there and daydream about the bustle of activity in the postal headquarters, and it will lend itself to something positive somewhere down the line. You have to leave room in your process for dreaming. All in all, I feel that my little experiment was a success. If nothing else but to reassure myself that my story hasn't gone bad like an old carton of milk. but is rather just fermenting in my brain like a fancy wine. It will be ready when it's ready. There's no real rush, especially when I am fortunate enough to be able to return to the Great Swamp in the comfort of my own imagination. I just hope that I'm able to share a piece of it sooner rather than later. So keep making weird art. Make houses and buildings and whole worlds out of cardboard. And don't be afraid to get playful and experimental. Find some unique ways to share your work and your story. Thank you so much for watching.